Well, thank you. So my presentation is going to be somewhat less empirical and somewhat more conceptual than Jabo's presentation. And I just want to put two issues on the table for us to for us to discuss and think about. One is what's meant by regional inequality. What is the objective? And secondly, what sort of lessons might the Chinese authorities learn from regional policies elsewhere in the world? And actually, it's the latter question which has been posed to Schengen, Jabo, and myself in terms of this paper that we're doing as input to the next 5-year plan and so on. And it's been the question we put to other scholars as well. So we all know there's been dramatic growth and spectacular reduction in poverty, but rapid increase in interpersonal inequality in many dimensions, including, of course, regional inequality, which is what we're discussing here today. Why are we concerned about increase in inequality? First, fast rise in inequality dissipates the impact of growth and poverty reduction. Secondly, high levels of inequality dissipate the impact of growth and poverty reduction. Even if they don't rise, if they're high, the impact of growth and poverty will be less. And thirdly, high levels of inequality may themselves affect growth through a number of channels, which the literature has discussed, including social tension and discontent, and that's going to be particularly important from the regional point of view. And finally, the issues that of the crisis and distribution, that in fact the growth path that was available to China over the last 30 years of export-led growth may no longer be available. And therefore, where is that demand going to come from? And that's where redistribution as a strategy to generate that demand has been discussed. So that's the background. And what I really want to, the first issue I want to put on the table is, why is regional inequality important? And really, there are two approaches one can think of. One is the standard economics approach, which is that it is important as a contribution to overall interpersonal inequality. The real objective is inequality between persons. And the reason why average differences between regions matter is because as these differences get large, they contribute to the national Gini. That's very much our perspective, I think, as economists. It's a utilitarian perspective, very much so. But the second perspective is that regional differences matter in and of themselves. The mean differences matter over and above the fact that they contribute to overall interpersonal inequality. This approach is less standard in economics, perhaps non-existent in economics, but it's much more common in other disciplines like political science, and also, I would put it to you, is common amongst policymakers. They may not quite think of it in terms of decomposition and inequality and so on, but really that's what they have in mind some of the time. So let me develop this thing. I think it makes a difference which view one takes in terms of policy, because it makes a difference to the standard debate on is policy meant to take jobs to the people, or is it meant to take people to the jobs? Okay? If locational identity doesn't matter, if where the person is, that the person's location doesn't matter, and all you're interested in is maximizing some national welfare, minimizing national poverty, etc., no matter where that poverty occurs, then, of course, we can do the analysis, so to speak, in terms of a pure utilitarian cost-benefit. If you put too many people in one place, there may be congestion costs, there may be efficiencies of infrastructure investment here, there, etc., and we can do a grand calculation, and it'll give you some optimal allocation of population, and we'll compare that to the current one, etc., etc. But if locational identity is important, if it matters that this region, this region's per capita income matters, and that simply depopulating that region to move everybody to Shanghai is not an option, okay, then I put it to you that the jobs to people part of the equation becomes more important and over and above the extent suggested by the pure cost-benefit analysis. And actually, I think this is something that I'd like to discuss in the discussion. I would say that for most countries, locational identity does matter. Total depopulation of a region is not an option, even if it, quote-unquote, makes sense in our narrowly economic cost-benefit sense. And examples of these, if you look through regional policies of Brazil, India, Canada, European Union, of course, which is a collection of countries, regions have identities, especially in federated structures, and especially if ethnic, religion, language, and other cleavages align with the spatial regional divisions. Then it's no longer the case that just the reason why the mean differences matter is because they contribute to overall interpersonal inequality. They matter because they matter. Mm-hmm. So one issue that I want to put on the table for you discussion is, given it's been argued sometime that given the high degree of homogeneity in population across China, almost everybody is ethnic Han Chinese and so on and so forth, do regional identities matter much less in the Chinese case. Okay? So that can a pure cost-benefit analysis be applied? And of course, this is something for policymakers to answer. How is it that they're perceiving this? But certainly our interpretation of what they're perceiving will be important in what recommendations, what policy options we put in front of them. I'll give you my guess. My guess is that China is no different than other countries in this regard. Okay, that's my hypothesis. Regional identity matters. Why? Firstly, there is indeed some ethnic, language, religion heterogeneity aligned with region. We all know about that. Okay? Second, even without such heterogeneity, long histories of common administration or acts of federation in other countries induce regional identities, even where there's ethnic homogeneity. Okay? Because Argentina, I mean, the divide between Argentina, between Buenos Aires and Cordoba is something that you can't understand in terms of heterogeneity of ethnic heterogeneity of population. It's just the interior provinces versus coastal. There's just hundreds of years of common administrative leads to that. In Britain, Scotland, Wales, etc., Malaysia, where you have it's a federated set of states, and to somehow think that it's all the same is just doesn't make sense. And even in the US, I'll come back to that. And the final point I'd make is that Chinese history shows remarkable attention actually to regional inequalities. I refer here to the work of the Berkeley historian Bin Wong, and this is part of a body of work that has followed up opening up of the archives of the Qing Empire and work on earlier periods. Here's, I just give a quote. I mean, there's a whole paper and a whole series of papers on this. It says, "No other imperial state in world history has bequeathed to its successors in the 21st century a government that continues to rule most all of the territory and a far vaster population that was once ruled by an empire." This paper, his paper, suggests how political accountability in both the 18th century and in contemporary China is achieved through balancing central-local relationships in ways that facilitate spatial integration through attention to equity issues. Okay? So these regions have identities in the minds of policymakers. They've always had that in the minds of policymakers, and today's policymakers are no different. At least that's what I'm putting to you for us to discuss. Okay. So that's one set of issues. The second set of issues, and this is the question that's been put to us, is what lessons does international experience have to offer to Chinese policymakers, assuming they're interested in regional inequality, both because of its contribution to interpersonal inequality and because regional inequality matters per se. Okay? Well, I would say that there is something to learn, but it's actually what is to be learned is somewhat subtle, I would say. Okay? Let me put these propositions to you. Well, I would say in general and in very broad terms, of course, regional policy is very similar across countries such as Brazil, Canada, India, the European Union. Just to give you an example, and what I'm going to read to you by the EU is basically pretty much what you'd get from policy statements for all these countries. Okay? Here's what the EU says. Okay, I'm not going to read it all, but it's the first bullet, the objective. 1 region in 4 has a GDP per inhabitant under 75% of the average. European regional policy is designed to induce economic and social cohesion, to reduce the gap between the development levels of the various regions. Clear objective, okay? To narrow the means between the different regions. What are the instruments? These instruments are fairly common across the board. There's a cohesion fund, which basically gives money out from the center. What for? For transport, infrastructure, etc., etc., etc. Okay? And you'd go to Brazil's national policy, India's national policy, any of these, in a very broad general sense, there's similarity across. And of course, this is what China has been doing in some general sense for a while. So in that sense, I'm not sure there's very much for Chinese authorities to learn in this generic broad sense. Okay? But it may be that we have something to learn from specific policy instruments, and let me take up that issue. But I would argue that here too, there is more to learn in some categories of instruments than in others. Let me explain what I mean by that. By considering 3 categories of regional policy instruments: infrastructure investment, social protection and investment broadly defined, and governance reform. So, infrastructure investment, I would say, here China, as Jabo mentioned, China has indeed been engaged in significant activity over the past 3 decades, and especially recently, especially in the last 10 years, there's been significant activity in this. And I would argue that the lessons to be learned are from Chinese experience itself. Finding out about whether investment has worked in Amazonas and so on, I'm not sure we should be investing resources in telling Chinese policymakers this is what happened in Brazil in that case. Rather, we should be investing resources finding out what actually happened when the Chinese government tried its Western strategy, etc. And the detailed work of IFPRI that Schengen referred to has in fact shown very specifically high rates of return to investment in the lagging regions in irrigation, in roads, in electricity, and telecommunications. We can get very specific about that, but it's really China-oriented research that I would say would have a high payoff in this context. Let's think about social protection and social investment. As all of you know, and people in IFPRI know, over the past 2 decades, in some sense, social protection and social investment have converged in the shape of conditional cash transfers. Meaning by that, you use these conditional cash transfers to build up the human capital of the poorest for education, for health, etc. And I would say that this is an area in which China does not have much experience in its recent history, certainly. And it is an area in which I believe Chinese policymakers could learn from international experiences in countries like Brazil, Mexico, and India. But what we should do is to highlight the regional dimensions of these programs, how the targeting of those programs to poorer regions has worked. So I think this is one area where there is learning to be done. And finally, governance reform. Let's think about, Xiaobo mentioned, one of the points that we make in our work is the importance of the decentralization that has been undertaken in China at the provincial level, and how this has actually, in our view, contributed to widening regional inequality. Whatever its contribution to growth, it has certainly contributed to widening regional inequality, both through our narrative analysis and through our time series econometric analysis. You can show that. Okay? And the question is whether there are elements of governance reform, local level governance reform, which might mitigate this. And of course, there's a lot of experience of local level governance reform. India's experiments with village level democracy, the different constitutional powers given to the regions in Brazil, etc., etc. The question is that really relevant for, are we going to use that experience to go to Chinese policymakers and say, here's what governance reform should be in Guizhou province, actually down to the county level, and so on. And I would argue that actually the political, locational, and cultural specificities make such experiences almost unusable, certainly unsuitable for translation in the Chinese case, and particularly for governance, because it's so context and politically and culturally specific. I would be careful about using cross-country experiences in this way. So rather, I think the argument that we would make, and maybe Xiaobo and others can elaborate on this, is that China should continue to conduct its own experiments in governance reform. And IFPRI has, in fact, evaluated some of these in the context of these panel data that Schengen mentioned, and maybe we can discuss some of those in the discussion. So its improvements in governance at the county level and below in the lagging regions, we believe, holds out greater promise, and detailed assessments of IFPRI can, in fact, help in this regard. Okay? And more generally, I would say that the experimental approach, trying out different instruments in different parts. So in some sense, the regional patterns of inequality actually act as a laboratory for China. It was done very successfully in terms of in the case of the agricultural reforms, and we're suggesting they should be doing that in this case as well. So let me conclude by revisiting the issues that I want to put on the table. Firstly, of course, inequality and regional inequality has been growing rapidly. But I would say the concerns about regional inequality go beyond its contribution to interpersonal inequality. This is true globally, and I believe it is true in China as well. So that bringing jobs to the people will be more important than a simple pure cost-benefit analysis might indicate. In terms of the instruments, I would say that a particular focus should be on social protection and social investment instruments for these reasons. Firstly, they are increasingly seen in conjunction with regional policy, certainly around the world, but particularly in China. These instruments have been relatively little used in recent Chinese history. Thirdly, there is a significant global experience of these instruments in many countries. And finally, unlike for infrastructure or for governance, in the case of social protection and social investment instruments, global experience may indeed be relevant for China. So I'll conclude.